Right around the world, we seem to be seeing the majority surrender their freedoms to ever-increasing, ever-caring, benevolent governments who promise to take care of us. And I am surprised the number of people who write to me, and indeed my peers as well. People are not so much asking what is going on in the world today, they're asking why. Why are people so willing to give up their freedoms for a bit of safety? Well, today it's my honor to be speaking with the man himself, Peter Hitchens. Peter Hitchens is globally known as an author, as a journalist, as a writer for the Mail on Sunday in the UK, and it's my honor to welcome him to the show. Hello, Peter.
Good morning as it is here. I'm not exactly sure what it is where you are.
6 p.m. over here, 9 a.m. where you are in Oxford. Peter, it is an honor to have you on the show because I think you did a great interview with Unlocked called The Slow Death of Freedom, and I encourage people to check out that interview. The link is in the description below. But very interested to ask your opinion, Peter, because it seems that most people are looking at micro issues, whereas the thing that stood out to me in that interview was you seem to take a more macro view starting back as early as 1914, and you're seeing a pattern emerging over time. So can we start with this, Peter? Could you help me make sense of what is going on in the world today?
I think I can, but only in some parts of the world. My basic experience is, first of all, my own country, particularly the English part of it, and of Western Europe and parts of Eastern Europe and of North America. And these countries have all really were all part of what used to be called Christendom. And as a result, they developed a particular form of liberty under the law, which has a lot to do with the Christian religion. And in my view, is dependent upon it. It lay underneath almost every law and constitution which existed in that part of the world. Continues to do so, though less and less understood, less and less acknowledged, less and less believed in. And the reason why I fix on 1914 is it was a convulsion, probably the greatest, not in the sense of good, but simply in the sense of being colossal, the greatest event in human history since the fall of the Roman Empire, when several things happened at once. One of the things which happened was that Christianity largely discredited itself in Europe by supporting a war which turned out for most of those involved to be completely disastrous, and leading to almost to its being swept away, for instance, in Russia, and to its immense weakening everywhere else in Europe. The United States, not being so closely involved and actually being a beneficiary of the war, didn't undergo this process, and Christianity remains a much stronger force there than in the human mind than it does in Western Europe, but that even now that's in decline, and that's has a lot to do, in my view, again, with a similar but not as colossal mistake made in the second Iraq War, George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq, which was supported by far too many Christians in North America and did a lot of damage to the Christian religion there. But fundamentally, what's arisen in the formerly Christian countries in this period have been two things. One, a stronger and stronger state to do with the fact that conscience and the family grow weaker and weaker, so there is no other source of authority than the state, and a growing self-indulgence by people who are no longer governed by Christian self-denial anyway, and fundamentally base their lives upon sovereignty over their own bodies, a view which I call selfism, which is incompatible really with the civil society because it simply denies the necessary self-restraint, which is vital for a proper civilization to function. So that's all been going on for more than a century now. And of course, it doesn't click immediately into place as a change. It gradually changes things, and many people who grew up under the old dispensation continue to act as if it was so. But then again, as you'll know, after the sun sets, there's a long afterglow during which it takes quite a while for darkness to fall. And in my view, all these societies, particularly the more prosperous and successful Western Anglosphere societies, are living in the afterglow of Christianity they no longer believe in. But that's really coming to an end now, I think.
Okay, so I'm interested that in the first a couple of minutes of our discussion, you've already pointed to Christianity as being the decline of Christianity as being behind all of this. When you said that liberty under the law is a function of our Christian, at least in the Western world, why is that? Because I tend to believe that, and people say, no, it's not. Freedom and liberty and these kinds of things came out of a Greco-Roman context, and it has nothing to do with Christianity. Can you explain this to me? Why is it a Christian thing fundamentally, including in the US? Did that come out of a Christian base? They have a strong liberty culture there.
The United States is a country founded by Christians, by Christians who of a particularly powerfully Protestant kind, who went in many cases to what is now the United States to escape what they regarded as the persecution and marginalization which they faced in England. So I know that many of the founding fathers of the actual American Republic were not Christians but deists. For the most part, they certainly were, and this is an important part of it. What lies under the whole concept of the rule of law? What lies under the whole concept of the rule of law is that there is something higher than temporal power, that kings are accountable, that there is a King of Kings and a Lord of Lords, and that there is something which says that even kings have to submit to some sort of higher power and some sort of set of beliefs about what is right and what is wrong. And there is obviously no force, no physical force which can make this happen. The king in his state is all powerful. So what is it? And I have to say, I believe that my own belief is that the greatest event in human history was the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So I think one of the ways in which this is demonstrated is the way in which the whole idea that law can be above power and power must bow to law originates. And there are many, many other aspects of it, including the way in which people behave in Christian societies differently from the way they behave in non-Christian societies. And the two things do mesh together and make each other possible. But nonetheless, where else can you find an actual workable origin for the crucial idea that law is above power?
So, Peter, it doesn't make sense to me in that, I mean, when I went to law school, we learned about the rule of law as this abstract concept that we can all submit to and accede to, but why can't we submit to that without it appealing to a higher authority? Why can't it be like a positive law, an inductive law, a UN-declared law of rights?
Why should you? Why should you obey it when it doesn't suit you? The whole point about law, about the rule of law, is that you obey it when it doesn't suit you. Everybody can obey the law when it suits them. Particularly governments can obey the law when it suits them. But when governments start to disobey the law when it doesn't suit them, which I think we'll all admit happens quite a bit, then it makes a big difference. And governments are fallible. We all know this, and they don't all the time do as they should. And in my view, less and less they do as they should, particularly when waging foreign wars, which seems to become fashionable again in the past few years. They are lawless. And the episode in which I've been greatly concerned, it's almost impossible to get anybody paying attention to it, but it is again of enormous importance. The episode when Britain, France, and the United States bombed Syria. It must be some years ago now. I keep forgetting the date. It's still so long. They bombed Syria because of what they believed to have been a chemical weapons outrage by Syria. Is one such. The United Nations Chemical Weapons Watchdog, the OPCW, investigated this event, and its investigators came to the conclusion that there wasn't sufficient evidence that Syria was responsible for this event. But their actual work was suppressed and bypassed and censored. And a report was issued saying that the Syrian government had done this thing. Now, that seems to me to be a prime example of international lawlessness, which goes largely unnoticed and totally unpunished.
So if we accept then that you can't have the rule...
If I could just go back to the beginning of your point, you can have a theoretical rule of law about power. I mean, a lot of people say that this operates. But unless it's a living, breathing thing with a central nervous system and a circulatory system and a brain, it's just a few words on a piece of paper. People have to believe in it. People have to believe that there will be consequences if they break the law, even if there's no one there to enforce it. And there you move into the area of the eternal. It's perfectly plain to any observer of human history and human society that there is no justice in temporal terms. It occasionally happens. Most of the time it doesn't. So where is justice? It's a thing for which we have such an enormous desire from the moment we become conscious as children. Nobody is more desirous of justice than children. They know instinctively that it's a good thing to be pursued, and adults know it too. So where is it? And the only place it can exist in reality is in eternity. And if there is no eternal life, there can be no justice. And that's pretty much a founding principle of everything I think. I desire justice. I desire justice for others. Therefore, I must desire it for myself. The only form in which justice could conceivably exist is in eternity. So I choose to believe in eternal life and in a deity who actually provides and metes out justice in eternity. That's what I believe. And that without that, the whole edifice of any civilization you get to look at is just a massive bluff.
So, Peter, I feel like we're coming up against a clash of worldviews. Let's say with what you're espousing now, with say Justin Trudeau, or some of our secular leaders here in Australia. They truly believe that you can have justice in the here and now, a utopian vision, and we can get to it. And that seems to be the motivation and reasoning behind why they bring in these social engineering and reformist agendas to shape our society in a particular way, which you've talked about in the 60s through the cultural reformations. So
they're very poor students of history in that case. And again, a fundamental principle on which I operate is the problem with utopia is that it can only be approached across a sea of blood, and you never arrive. And this is demonstrable all down history. Every attempt to create utopias, whether national or international, has failed for the reason that human perfectibility is not available. We are, by our nature, flawed, and we will always fail. No straight thing can be made out of the crooked timber of humanity, as I think Immanuel Kant once remarked, and I think it turns out to be pretty thoroughly true if you examine all the efforts at utopias and paradises and world government which have been attempted so far. And I don't see any reason to suppose that will be different in future. I can't help it if people don't know any history or prefer not to know what they've been told. But Justin Trudeau, yes, quite well. There we are. If that's the future, things are worse than I thought.
Well, but
he's quite a good boxer, though.
Yeah. But if you look at our world today, it can, in a way, be described as a utopia if you go back 500 years or more. Are you saying the only reason we have progressed to this place is not because of these utopian impulses, but rather it's because of the rise of the Judeo-Christian worldview through the 1800s through Britain?
Well, I'm not sure I really believe in progress. I believe in improvement, but the idea that you can measure forward motion, it's like so many of the claims made by people all the time. You say to them, well, have you got a progressometer, which tells you which way society is moving, which way is up, which way is down? And we are basically like an avalanche victim who's lying there in the snow. He doesn't know which is up and which is down, and which, let alone what is north and what is south. So I think the whole concept of progress is suspect, to put it mildly. Things change. Sometimes they change for the better. Equally often they change for the worse. People who use the term progress tend to mean things that I like are happening more than they used to, rather than actually being able to offer any definition of progress. We talk about ourselves becoming more humane and kinder and less cruel. What tends to happen is we cease to be cruel in one way and we become cruel in another. Most people would say, yes, it was probably a very bad thing that teachers used to thrash children with canes and leather straps. It was a good thing that nowadays we drug them with amphetamines instead. I would say that we've swapped one bad thing for another, and to call that progress would be dishonest. So, is there progress? No, there is sometimes change for the better. In any case, we live in an abiding city. All civilizations fall, all towers crumble, all castles All castles fall to dust. Everything eventually comes to an end. Our purpose may not be to do those things. It certainly is true that societies which adopts, how shall I put it, rigorous Christian morality tend to be successful societies. But that's not may not be the purpose of Christian thought. The purpose of Christian thought is the salvation of the individual soul and the reforming of the individual person, not some idea of endless, unbroken human progress. And it's a different way of thinking, and it's now become so eccentric that even to utter some of the things that I'm saying is regarded as close to insane by people who've bought the utopian idea of endless human progress and of ever stronger, ever more interventionist government, which many people actually have, combined, as I say, with the unlimited personal indulgence. Which is fine. I mean, who can deny that unlimited personal indulgence is fun? It is, but there are other things about it.
It is great fun. But what about the things that they point to, like quantity and quality of life and increasing living standards and those sorts of things? Aren't we seeing an overall trend of progress, shall we say, or improvement over time? It seems to be getting better.
But what are you comparing it with? My great point of comparison, 1914. So in 1914, Western Europe was a civilization of great efficiency and luxury for many people, hugely improved standards of life over where things had been before. So people say, well, would you go back to 1914? I said, well, absolutely not, because what has happened since 1914 in terms of medical and scientific progress is enormous, and we were able to do all kinds of things. We even have building materials and other things which we did not have then. We have electronic knowledge which we did not possess at the time. What I would say, though, is there were many aspects of the world of 1914 which were superior to what we have now. And I'd say one of my great tests of the civilization is, does it have any railways? Because I think that the motor car has been a catastrophe for Western civilization. It's destroyed landscape, destroyed cities. Oh, right. I remember Hillary Clinton once remarking that cigarettes were the only product which, used according to the manufacturer's instructions, would cause their users to become ill. That's not true. The motor car is another one. If you become the slave of the motor car, you never take any exercise. You invariably get severe back problems. You shorten your life. And apart from the damage that you do to your neighbors with the filth that you pour out into the air and the horrible noise you constantly make. It's been the ugliness of the motor car society never ceases to astonish me, compared with this also grandeur, stateliness, and beauty of a society where the main forms of transport were on rails. Added to the fact, which I might point out to those who believe that that human activity is causing global warming, added to the fact that the friction between a steel wheel and a steel rail is 1/32 that between a rubber tire and a road, which means, of course, that rail transport is immensely less wasteful of energy. So we threw that away in 1914. It's just one point at which I think the Europe of 1914, uninterrupted by war, could have developed into a much more beautiful, much cleaner, much quieter, much more peaceful place than what we have now. We tend to think that the luxuries and the facilities we have now are the only kind of luxuries or facilities we ever could have had. I think society could have developed quite differently, with a good deal more self-restraint and a good deal more peace into a very advanced civilization, different from the one which we now live in and to some extent admire.
Well, my friend, we've gone deep very fast. This is a fun interview. All right.
Let me being here if you don't, frankly. The deep dive is always the most frightening, but the most fun, isn't it?
It is. Everybody, we're inching towards, I'm going to be asking Peter about, why people are acting the way they are today. But to get there, let me ask you about the cultural revolutions and the disintegration of family. One of the most amazing quotes, I'll send you this graphic I made of one of the quotes you said. Let me read it for everyone. You said, in this Unlocked interview, a country which decides that it's going to fundamentally weaken the family will appear to many of its friends and indeed its neutral observers as if it is creating liberty. But the trouble with these things is that they actually, by removing responsibility and choice from the individual, place them in the hands of the state and tend towards the creation of a stronger state to deal with people who are no longer restraining themselves in the ways that they did under the old dispensation. I guess in many ways this could sum up the cultural revolutions from the 60s onwards.
Yes, it does. But ask me a question.
Question is, how has this transformed the way people think to the point where now they see it as a noble and a righteous thing to keep each other safe, just comply, do what you're told, give the authority to the government? It's not just something to do, it's the righteous thing to do. That's what I'm seeing nowadays.
Well, people will always think it's the righteous thing to do, and that's the great power of it. If it was presented as a wicked or a stupid thing to do, people wouldn't do it. If you appeal to the desire to do good in people, which exists in everybody, you will get a response. Part of the answer to the question is it actually doing the things which are claimed? And one of the problems of skeptics such as I during the past 16 months or so has been trying to point out, look, this may not be as beneficial as you think. At the very least, it's almost certainly disproportionate. My metaphor for it is a man burning down his house to get rid of the wasp's nest. You do get rid of the wasp's nest, perhaps, but you haven't got a house at the end of it, and action has to be proportionate. So no, I'm not against appeals to goodness, but I think that appeals to goodness should be informed, both in the people who make the appeals and the people who respond to them. That's really much more an aspect of the decline of education in our society that we used to create through disciplined education, in which authoritative teachers handed down knowledge and taught people how to think. We used to create a quite substantial, I would call it a layer in society of people who were capable of thinking skeptically about what was put before them by government and authority. Now we haven't got that. But that's not really to do with the destruction of the family. That's to do with the destruction of authority in education, which has been colossal, and the destruction certainly in my country of selection by ability in education, which has led to the creation of a school system which must be one of the most shameful in any advanced country ever to have existed.
So do the weaknesses in our thinking ability, our critical reasoning ability, do they stem from what we've been through over the last 50 years? Have we created this? Is this a long-term trend? Which therefore means...
I can talk about my own country, and I can observe what's happened in some other countries where I've visited or lived. And it seems to me that in general, the nature of education has altered, and that people are simply not given either enough knowledge or enough reasoning capacity, or even encouraged into independent thought enough. So that part of society, which will always have been reflected before, both in the media and in parliament and among politicians and in the church and among lawyers and everywhere else to do with the general high-level public opinion which influences civilized governments, that has disappeared. If you want to, I'm very lucky. I just caught the end of being educated properly. I'm not very well educated by the standards of my own time, but in the land of the gormless, the half-educated man is king. But he's also in some danger, because to actually state an ungormless thing in a gormless society is to attract derision, which I get a lot of. We simply haven't got enough people capable of dissenting anymore. They don't reach the critical mass necessary for society and government to say, hang on, maybe this wasn't a sensible thing to do.
Is that phenomenon emergent, or is that planned in some way?
I don't think any of this is planned. I think that what we have here is a failure of light, not a deliberate creation of darkness. And this is very interesting, the relation between light and darkness. You cannot project darkness. Darkness is an absence, just as cold is an absence. You can't generate cold in the way you can generate heat. I mean, there's a sort of way in which in a refrigerator you can do it. But basically, cold is an absence of heat, darkness is an absence of light. What has happened has been a failure of a previous system of thought, a previous way of doing things, rather than, there certainly have been people who've taken advantage of this failure. I used to be one of them. I'm a former Marxist-Leninist. I know in detail what my enemies desire, and you can see how delighted they must have been at the crumbling from within of all the institutions which used to look invincible. But I don't think they were capable of achieving it on their own. I think that what fundamentally happened was that Christendom committed suicide.
So the reason why I bring up this quote is it struck me because you talked about how people were getting liberty through these cultural revolutions. They thought they were getting liberty, but in fact they were simply moving. Yeah, they were simply moving their reliance away from, the family unit and so on onto the state. So right now, as we surrender our liberty for safety, are we doing the same thing as we did with family in the 60s?
One is a consequence of the other. I think people would be so willing to do it if they hadn't already surrendered that liberty in such large measure. It's if you begin with what used to happen in families, the hated patriarchy, the family more or less led by the father and with the assistance of the mother, where children were brought up, and traditions and faith and all kinds of, as it were, the law of the tribe were handed down, and private life existed. And you look now at circumstances where, because of the catastrophic failure of marriages to hold together, the state takes more and more of a role in the upbringing of children, and the state's intervention, like from everything from moral education, such as it is, to upbringing, to sex education, and all the rest. It's all done by the state. The family doesn't really exist in the way that it used to, as a transmission belt of culture, and this happened because people wanted to be free of the restraints of marriage, and they were free of the restraints of marriage. There was a horrible song by a man called Engelbert Humperdinck, which is incredibly more popular than the Beatles. People should in the what were then the music charts of the late 1960s, and this song was called "Please Release Me," and it was a hymn to divorce. When
really?
Yeah, basically. Well, look at the words. Please release. I mean, just look them up sometime. That's why it was so popular. Because what had happened about that time was that governments all over the Western world, particularly the British and American, I don't know Australian history in this, but had decided that they would reform the divorce laws to make divorce immensely easier. Yeah. And here is the thing, and I never cease to point this out because it's so astonishing. Anybody who has any experience in civil law will know that what it is basically about is the enforcement of contracts. You make a contract, you break it, then the other guy in the contract goes to court and either gets you to pay up or gets you to abide by the contract you sign. In the case of marriage, since about 1968, 69, what the courts have been doing is taking the side of the person who wants to break the contract.
Yeah.
And it's absolute reverse of the normal practice of civil law. It's unique in civil law. In fact, the main purpose of the courts is to help people break their contracts. And therefore, here was a thing which was based entirely on a private agreement between two people. They had decided to do it, often in the face of the congregation, but sometimes just at the register office. But they said, we, as A and B, have decided we are going to stay together for life, bring up children, found a family, stick at it. And the state had, until then, more or less supported that and had made it difficult to break that contract. And then suddenly, in the late 1960s, took a decision to make it not merely easy to break that contract, but in some cases to favor to favor the person who broke it, not just in terms of saying, yes, you can leave, which is not really what divorce is about. Divorce is about remarriage, but in many cases, the person who had actually decided to break up the marriage ended up also with the house and the children. Because case law tended in that direction. So a huge revolution, whether you like it or not, you have to see it as a huge revolution. And of course, large numbers of adults greatly benefited from it. They got what they wanted. They got a freedom they had long desired, and they felt good about it. The principal sufferers in the whole of the Western world have been the millions and millions of children who were then left without a stable family life and who were thrown much more upon the institutions of state. Now, among well-off people, this isn't so catastrophic. But among the poor, the absence of fathers, particularly from the lives of young men, has been enormous. And the state struggles to cope. The state has also hugely encouraged, in the aftermath of this, women to go out to paid work rather than to raise their own children. But it completely struggles to replace the enormous amount of nurture which families gave both their fathers and their mothers to children. And this is the point at which the strong state needs to develop. People cease to behave as well as they used to when they were brought up in families and had fathers. And the state has no way of making them behave any better, so it becomes more punitive. and it becomes more authoritarian in dealing with breaches. And what's more, this punitive authoritarianism fails in its own aims, because it's not capable of doing what the family used to do. And half of the crisis of crime and drug taking and antisocial behavior, which we find in Western societies, is probably more than half, is a consequence of the fatherless, broken family. But the state can't replace it, and the state also has no intention of restoring it. So here we are with this enormous social crisis all over the Western world, in countries which are fantastically rich by the standards of history.
Okay, so
it's a revolution, and but the only response anyone can make for it is more laws, more police officers, more attempts at intervention, which repeatedly fail, and a society of people who are more and more ready to be governed by the state, because they were never given in early life either the self-discipline or the independence to cope as free members of society, restraining themselves. This is the simple Edmund Burke point. If you don't restrain yourself, then others will place chains upon you.
This is all very logical, Peter, and there is a resurgence.
It's extraordinarily logical, isn't it? Irritating.
There's a but coming in my question.
I can see it coming.
This is all quite logical, and this is why I think we've seen the resurgence of people like Jordan Peterson who are pushing this very line. That's not new at all. This self-response. Absolutely, the self-responsibility line.
I read his 12 steps to happiness, or whatever it's called, and it seemed to me not to contain that message very much.
Okay, I'm more referring to his lectures where he pushes people to take responsibility for their own lives and put the chains on themselves rather than wait for others.
Well, okay, I mean, maybe up to a point, but I'm not sure that it's combined with the Christian moral sense. And what are the restraints he wants them to put on themselves?
Well, he's only a shadow of the greats of the past. But anyway, besides the point, my point is, this is logical, and we are seeing some people speak to some of it, like he is, some of it. However, it is very difficult for me. I'm in my 30s. It is impossible for me to go out before my peers and convince them to go back to marriage being a contract for life. If I said that to them, they would think I'm crazy. They think it's normal. You have to be able to move on. People change. Marriages end. So my question is this: How do you possibly fight for the values of old, even if they are correct, even if they're logical, when the culture has moved on such that we look like crazy people saying these things?
Well, you've mistaken me. I make no attempt to do anything about this. I believe that the forces of which I approve are long ago defeated. I'm simply here to point out this is what you're doing. You're destroying civilization. And so you ought to notice, maybe at some point in the future, when people examine the suicides of several previously happy, free, and prosperous civilizations, they'll notice that this is what they did, and I'm really hoping to contribute to the record of that, so that they in future will avoid it. I think we've had it. I think all the Anglosphere countries have had it long ago. I have no political program. I don't seek to influence politics. I simply point out this is what's going on. I agree with you. Most of what I say would be regarded by almost anybody under 60 as the ravings of a lunatic, but I long ago became used to that. It doesn't matter.
Why do you do it, Peter?
I'm stating it because I've come to the conclusion that the stating of the truth is in itself a good act, even if it has no discernible effect. There's a great passage somewhere in G.K. Chesterton, who I don't actually much like, but this is really good, where he points out that what we do here matters somewhere else, and that much of our life is we're like barbarians crashing into a great palace or castle and finding a tapestry which has fallen from the walls and staring at the wrong side of it, trying to make out what it means. Well, all the time, if we only turned it over and looked at the other side, we could see, but we look at things from the wrong side. I say what we do here matters somewhere else, and most of what we think we see, we mistake for something else. But simply pointing out the truth has become, for me, an action worth taking for its own sake. But no, I have no political program. I don't believe this can be reversed. You can't overthrow a 2,000-year-old moral system. and expect to recreate it. And the fascinating thing about what are loosely called taboos is you can break them and destroy them in an afternoon, but it takes centuries to build them up.
Yeah. It's blowing my mind, that G.K. Chesterton thing. Can we just take a biographical diversion for a moment? How long have you been of this opinion that it's lost, the war is lost, but what you're doing right now is very important, to speak the truth that is noble in its own right?
I don't know if it's important. I don't know if it's important. Don't give me any more vanity than I already possess. Whether it's important or not will be established by others in other times. It may be totally insignificant and a complete waste of time. Probably what I ought to be doing is going out partying instead. But the fact is, I think it's important. I don't know it's important. How long? A basic moment of fundamental despair was in 2010, when after many years of pointing out that the British Conservative Party, which is typical of Anglosphere conservative parties and not being conservative at all, should be destroyed. I could not persuade people in my own country to withhold their votes from David Cameron, a man so obviously slippery and unconservative that it seemed to me to be patently plain to anybody of intelligence discrimination that he didn't deserve to become prime minister, and that if he did so, it would be a disaster for the country. What happened was that in my country, people voted to save the Conservative Party, which was their enemy. And I realized at that point, which I should have understood long before, but irrevocably at that point, that most of the people who were supposedly my readers, supporters, admirers, whatever else were, wouldn't actually pay any attention to any political advice I gave them. Because people had constantly said, oh, well, you talk a good game, you write a column, you go on the TV, you say this, you say that, but what do you actually do? They said, why do you stand on the sidelines, whatever sidelines are? I said, well, look, how can I get into politics when there is no political party, which is mine? Even if I could become an individual member of parliament, I would have no influence. It would only be as a member of an organized political party. There is no political party with which I agree. And they said, what do you want to do about it? I said, well, there is a very simple way of achieving this. The Conservative Party has lost a whole load of elections in a row. If it loses another one, catastrophically enough, then people will cease to give money to it and it will fall down. And we can then replace it with something better. And it seemed to me to be perfectly sensible. It's no more difficult concept than the one which I think most car drivers know, which is when your car overheats, you turn up the heating. It's a good way of cooling it. It's not. It's slightly counters what you would think was natural, but it would work. I couldn't get anyone to pay any attention. So having been told for years and years, why don't you get involved in politics? I got involved in politics. I said, whatever you do, don't vote Conservative. And nobody paid any attention. The Conservatives actually didn't win that election because, as I predicted, they couldn't. But they were then rescued by the Liberal Party and went into government. And people imagined they had one. And then they discovered what I'd been telling them for year after year after year, that David Cameron was actually indistinguishable from Anthony Blair. And now they all say, "Gosh, you were right." But the moment went, and I realised that it was just too complicated and too difficult for most people to cope, and also that politics in Anglosphere countries tends to be tribal rather than a matter of the intellect. People don't actually vote by thinking about it; they vote for a tribe. So I gave up. I thought this is futile. I'll just have fun telling people they're wrong.
So what do you make of the people today fighting back, trying to educate people, or politically move them from surrendering their freedoms to the globe, especially in the Commonwealth countries, the giving up of our freedoms for government? Is this a losing battle? Should they give up? What do you think?
Well, I'm not in favour of giving up in general, but who are you referring to? I mean, what happened in my country to those people who were sceptical about the COVID panic was that they were simply overpowered. Yeah. It didn't matter how good your arguments were. There were several very distinguished scientists, for instance, who were trying to make the point that there was an alternative approach to this. In Sweden, Anders Tegnell actually demonstrated there was an alternative approach to it, but they might as well not have bothered. They were simply overborne by the huge power of a wholly dead parliament in which there was no opposition, a wholly compliant judiciary which wouldn't even entertain attempts to question through judicial review the government's actions. A submissive civil service and again, almost totally unanimous media. And in the middle of that, how are you going to get anywhere? And also, what you also had, partly as a consequence of the death of private life, was an extraordinarily conformist and easily led population. So there was never really any contest, I don't think. The battle had to be fought for its own sake, for what would once have been called honor. But I don't think there was ever really much prospect. There were moments when I thought we might get somewhere, but they were very quickly, I was disabused of that.
Do you feel the same way about the USA when we have, Rod DeSantis rising up in Florida? He seems to be winning.
Well, I don't think any great lesson has been learned from it nationally in the general public, or in the United States media, or indeed in the electronic media, which increasingly dominate. There are still, because of the nature of the USA and the fact that individual states still have some powers to act, it can be demonstrated, as it was demonstrated in Sweden, that there are other approaches than the one of organized panic. But in the end, most people are still completely compliant with the general view. And if there is any discontent about the handling of COVID in my country, it's among people who say, oh, well, we should have locked down sooner. And that is what, when there is eventually a public inquiry into this, people such as me will almost certainly not even be invited to testify to it, or people with my opinions and experts in my opinions will not even be asked to come before it. And it will conclude, after a lot of rumbling, that indeed we did not lock down soon enough. That is the orthodoxy. I live in a country where the orthodoxy will always flatten me as a steamroller would flatten a frog.
Just on that, why do you have any opinion on why journalists seem to have sold out? They're supposed to be the people holding power to account.
I think journalism has changed greatly since I first went into it. The funny thing was, when I first went into newspaper reporting, there were a lot of newspapers, and they were much more competitive than they are now. But also, we were all filled with admiration for Bernstein and Woodward at the Washington Post, and the overthrow of Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal, and a number of other episodes such as the Pentagon Papers. And we took that side, and it was a general belief. But I think that generation of journalism has been overwhelmed by another, brought up in a completely different school. An awful lot of journalists now see it as a stepping stone to getting into politics, for instance, or enjoy far too much their contacts with politicians and become the politicians' servants. The proper relation between newspapers and politics is that between a dog and a lamppost, as H.L. Mencken rightly said. But that relation was almost totally ended. So many people who get involved in the coverage of politics allow themselves to become notice boards on which the government pins whatever it wants to say.
So where do you see the mindset of the people around the world today? Let's just talk about the West for a second. You've got a population around the place that is just completely besotted with government right now. Governments are pushing fear messaging like you wouldn't believe. Here in Australia, we're still locking down hard. They're rolling out ads of 30-year-olds gasping for air in hospital beds.
Yes, I've seen that. It's disturbing, isn't it?
We've had a lot of medical professionals come out and say that is completely inaccurate, that what she's wearing, that's not how she would be treated in ICU. Anyway, where do you think the people are at? Are they going to be sensitive or not sensitive to, obviously not to reason, but is there another way to wake them up? Is there a way to refire that love of liberty and autonomy and agency?
No, you see, my attitude towards them is one of sympathy and love. I don't despise them for being influenced by fear. I think they're victims. I don't regard the great mass of the population who disagrees with me as my enemy. I think they're the victims of fear propaganda and of manipulation, as people have been all down the ages. And I think they've been abandoned by the raison d'etre, the failure of the supposedly intelligent and educated classes to stand up on their behalf as well as their own. I think fear is incredibly powerful emotion. I've written in praise of fear and saying people should be more afraid because it teaches you things which no other emotion does. But it's very powerful. It shouldn't be abused. But what government has done is it's made people afraid. I've been very fortunate in my life, a number of things. Which mean that although I am a state-registered coward in terms of physical combat, I don't panic at the sight of a propaganda poster or a propaganda TV program or whatever it happens to be. I tend to be much less susceptible to that than most people. And so that's my good fortune, to be as old as I am, to have grown up in a society where people were brought up differently. And for goodness sake, I read the historical romances of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, which I doubt very much whether any child now could even understand. But they were all about valor and not giving in a way which nowadays would be regarded as eccentric and probably rather comical.
So given that the society...
By the way, particularly Sir Nigel and the White Company and Michael Clarke, terrific books.
So given society's moved on so radically, what is the type of leader that the world needs now, or at least our countries?
For heaven's sake, I'm not promoting leaders.
No. I'm asking for a hypothesis here.
The word leader sends a shudder through my entire skeleton. I hate the word leader.
Okay.
I'm prepared to have a First Lord of the Treasury advising his or her Majesty, but the idea of leaders is repellent to me. I don't.
Do you not see value in
politicians should not aspire to be anything more than temporary heads of a government which they've been put in charge of for a bit, recognizing that they're responsible to those who went before them and to those who will come after them. Leader is, to me, it's a repellent concept.
Do you not see the value in a cultural leader then, or the inevitability of leaders in culture to shift our society?
The word leader, as I say, I don't like. I think that people can that there should be, in any serious civilization, there should be people who are capable of guiding the thought of others, I think, and explaining it, and there should be educators, but that's what they should do. I think government should be enormously limited. I think that the task of those of us who have some facility with language is normally to be critical of power, rather than to be helpful to it. Whether writing fiction or nonfiction, the moral lessons you should be trying to spread are those of human freedom. And the perfect freedom which allows you to take the right decision as a free human being. But leadership, the whole idea of it repels me.
So how is society, I was going to say led, how is society shaped then? Is it just through the mass emergent will of the people?
Well, as I say, before the collapse of Christendom, a society was shaped by the Christian religion and its precepts, which everybody believed and understood and knew at a surprisingly high level. I mean, you would, thinking of my father's brothers and sisters, particularly brought up in right at the end of the pre-1914 era, their level of knowledge of both their own country's history, of the Christian religion, of the actual scriptures, of English literature, would shame almost any modern university graduate. And these were people of the lower middle class. My grandfather was a teacher whose own father had been a dockyard labourer, whose grandfather had been an agricultural labourer tramping across the country. That's the kind of people they were. That's the sort of thing they knew. They all knew the Bible. They all knew English history. They knew masses of poetry and literature. And this was in a level of society now more or less neglected by the education system, fobbed off with cheap goods, and that's gone. And because the authority necessary to teach it is gone. And it isn't there anymore. So people are left drifting in this sea of unknowing in which they're influenced by advertisements and television programs. And also hugely, I have to say, by popular music. One of the things about popular music, people don't examine the lyrics as much as they should, particularly of the stuff that I used to listen to in the 60s. It's very powerful in spreading to certain types of message. And people have compared Bob Dylan's Chimes of Freedom to the Sermon on the Mount. It was his Sermon on the Mount, for instance. These people may not even remember where they heard it, but there are things in that song which must have had huge amounts of influence. A lot of what he sang on what people think, and not just him either. Those are the influences which people now find themselves subject to. And nothing wrong with that if you have any recourse to the older and greater ideas of how humans should behave. But the problem is so many people are just completely alone, mapless, in a vast savannah, trying to work out which way to go and not really getting any very good advice.
So if people are mapless, then are we going to be taken advantage of by someone with an agenda?
We are being taken advantage of, are we not?
We are?
It's possible. I mean, look at people buy instant mashed potato, for goodness sake, and vote New Labour. And if that isn't a sign people have been taken advantage of, I don't know what is. Have you read Vance Packard's Hidden Persuaders?
No.
Oh, well, it's amazing. It's an astonishing book. It's from the inside of the advertising and public relations industry.
Okay.
Written just at the point when politicians were beginning to discover these techniques.
Yeah.
Very easy to read, not long. Once a sort of modern classic, but vital for anyone to read to understand the nature of manipulation to which we are subjected all the time. You need to be, as I say, very well educated to resist it.
I'm gonna read that. Sounds great. Hey, before I talk about the future, I want to get some predictions from you. I know you love doing predictions. Commonwealth countries. Why the hell are all of the Commonwealth countries the craziest? We have an underground church in Canada. We have authoritarians popping up like Muppets in UK, here in Canada, but not in New Zealand. But the other countries, they have their own issues, but they don't seem to be nearly as mad and police power and that kind of thing. What is going on with us?
Well, perhaps it's the corruption of the best is the worst of all. And we had an awful lot of freedom in the Anglosphere countries because we had paid the moral price for it. And the level of the extraordinary things, such as genuine presumption of innocence and truly independent juries, which don't really exist anymore in Britain, and an adversarial parliament, which meant your fellow countryman Richard Neville said this about in the 1960s. So there was an inch of difference in those days in Britain between the Conservative and the Labour parties, but it was in that inch that we all lived. Well, that inch is closed now. There is no gap between the major parties in the Anglosphere countries. They don't really have any real differences at all. So there is no adversarial government. Adversarial justice has more or less come to an end. Adversarial newspapers, which also used to be very much featured in Britain, where the newspapers were very diverse in the opinions. That's pretty much gone as well. It's almost unanimous now what they say. And we were granted all these tremendous freedoms, which we didn't understand and didn't value. And as I said, we've been living in the afterglow of them for many years, and now the moment has come when the darkness finally falls. So the freer you were, if you're ultimately unfit to exercise freedom or unwilling to defend it, then the greater your fall will be. Could be the explanation you're seeking.
Wow. So the Commonwealth countries had it so good that they were the furthest to fall.
People think that freedom is like the air. They think it's just there naturally. They don't. Yeah. Particularly now, history has ceased to be taught properly. They don't know how it came into existence in the first place, and therefore they have no idea of the nature of the attack upon it, or even that there is an attack upon it, let alone how to defend it.
So where do we go from here then? If we extrapolate this into the coming age, you know the old quote, good men create good time, strong men create good times, and then good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times, but hard times create strong men again, and you get this cycle going. Is it possible we're about to enter a mini dark ages, of at least an intellectual dark ages for a period of time?
I know this is the Rod Dreher Benedict option, where those of us who still have historic and moral sensibilities retreat into fortified monasteries on the tops of mountains and wait for it all to end. I have no idea. It's pretty easy to predict in general that things are heading downwards. And of course, there is the thing we have barely mentioned, which is the economic damage done in the past 18 months by the wealthy countries, and also the enormous problem of China. Will China become the dominant model of government in the world? And I fear very much that might be the case. But on the other hand, China has its own, as you will know, being close to it, China has its own internal problems, which could at any time cause it to fall into serious crisis. So who knows? But anybody looking at things as they are now would not be making confident predictions for the free countries of the world remaining the most prosperous or the most strong. And if that happens, and if China does become the hegemonic global power, which it might well become, then I think things look pretty grim for anybody who values freedom.
Well, I must say there's the economic dominance, but we certainly have the cultural dominance in the pandemic handling. I don't know about in Britain, but in Australia, we had pandemic readiness plans completely thrown out, and we copied the Wuhan model of lockdown.
Exactly, yeah. We had plans too, which were completely thrown out, and Wuhan model was more or less copied. It's extraordinary.
So, because you're a little bit older than me, a little bit more learned,
older for certain.
You've had more time to read, you see. I'm young. I'm in my 30s. What should people like myself who are, we're seeing there's something not quite right and we're not sure of the world we're heading into. You said in your interview you thought you were going to be dead before all of this came. So, and even now, you can think, you've got 30, 40, whatever you got left. I'm thinking, I'm 30, I've got 70 years. What am I going to be seeing? I have no idea how to get ready for this, Peter. I don't know what I'm walking into.
Well, I think prepare for the worst would be good advice.
I don't even know how to do that.
No, you might start imagining how. No, but we've been given a preview, I think, in the past 16 months in the COVID panic of how quickly free countries can degenerate into something completely different. This on the basis of fear of a disease. But if, for instance, another major war comes about, and I think there are a lot of people who would, for instance, in the United States, who would quite like a conflict with Russia or with Iran. If another major war comes about, then see that as the pretext for narrowing society, and imagine how that could be. And that is currently my worst nightmare, that Europe goes to war again.
You say a pretext for narrowing of society, but it's not that that's their goal. These people do it with noble intents of their heart.
Well, the thing about tyranny is it's a weed. It grows unless it's kept back. I don't know whether you do any gardening. I don't either, but I know people who do, and half the job is keeping the weeds down. And what the great strength of the English and later the British system between about the 18th century and the early 20th century was an amazing willingness to cut back the weeds, to keep the weeds under control. But it's more or less exemplified by the government department we call the Home Office. It constantly wants to recreate some sort of Tudor tyranny in this country of what we would now call surveillance and authority. And things such as major terrorist events or an outbreak of serious disease or a war give it the opportunity to do so, and have done. I mean, before this happened, the terrorism fear was the pretext for the removal of liberty from people. So a lot of the protections against the state in terms of detention and presumption of innocence was severely undermined after September the 11th. And it's because of this tendency in government to grope blindly towards greater power, which unless there are strong forces restraining it, will simply happen. That's why I use the word pretext.
Okay. So what do you think about, at the moment, we seem to have, well, for example, we're vaccinating the planet now, right? That seems to be an issue that's dividing people in terms of bodily autonomy. I think you said in a column that, you needed it to travel, so you didn't particularly want this vaccine, but whatever, you got it anyway. Is that the solution? We just comply and get along with our lives?
I never thought the vaccine was much of an issue, honestly.
It is here in Australia. It's huge.
Well, it's okay. I mean, it's not. I've had so many vaccinations, including a very unwise one against yellow fever at the age of 59, which I discovered afterwards was a fantastically dangerous thing to do. 60 is generally seen as the absolute cutoff point, after which it's far too dangerous to get yellow fever vaccination. But I didn't know that. I did a lot of traveling. I've taken anti-malaria pills, for goodness sake, which I wouldn't advise anyone to do it unless they absolutely had to. And since my earliest youth, I've been vaccinated against who knows what. So I've got no particular bother about vaccines as such. I've never seen it as a thing to get.
No, but that's not, the vaccine's not really the point. The point is that is the thing that they're pressing, at least on us here in Australia and America. And then the question is, do we just give them what they want so we can do we just trade? We'll give them what they want, we get our freedoms. Is that how we just need to look at it? Like Russia?
If that worked, that'd be great. But what's been noticeable since huge numbers of people have been vaccinated in Britain, where actually hypochondria is quite a low level. But we have not got our freedom back as a result. It's still incredibly difficult to travel. Life is still enormously constrained. People tell me that on the 19th, 6 days from now, that we're going to get a lot of our freedom back. But I think people will be surprised at how little freedom they get back. And in any case, the damage that has been done to our economy by the enormous expenditure of funny money, which didn't exist, will begin to hit soon. And there are terrible things. One of the things you really oughtn't to do in modern Britain is to fall ill of anything other than COVID.
Oh, yeah.
Because having had a national health service, you now basically have a national COVID service, and huge numbers of people have had important procedures and tests and things delayed. And the legacy of that over years to come is going to be huge. But what seems to me to be the case, then there's the case of mask wearing, which, in my view, is an imposition of without justification. It's although it's technically going to be lifted, people are still going to be able to demand it under certain circumstances. So, for instance, I'm a blood donor. I've been a blood donor since 1970. But unless I'm prepared to wear a mask while donating blood, which is a ludicrously pointless thing to do, I can't do it anymore. And I don't think that this liberation on Monday is going to change that. Nor is it going to change the view of so many people who, if I get on a train not wearing a mask, will look at me as if I'm a horrifying example. Well, I wouldn't go that far, but a deeply selfish and stupid person. Well, I may be a deeply selfish and stupid person, but that isn't the reason why.
You know, we started this conversation, Peter, on Christianity. Coincidentally, I've had so many chats about Christianity the last couple of months. Let's talk about that, because Christianity, to me, seems to be unkillable. As many people who try to snuff it out, it seems to be the fertilizer for Christianity persecution. You know, look at the church in China.
It thrives on persecution. But what it doesn't thrive on is indifference.
Yes, but we're moving into a world where
what we have in the Western society is indifference towards it, and that has killed it far more effectively than the modern marshmallow totalitarianism never does the stupid thing of locking up Alexander Solzhenitsyn or whatever it is. It doesn't do that. Well, it makes sure that potential Solzhenitsyn just lose their university posts or lose their jobs in general, which Amnesty International is never going to intervene over. It imposes its will by soft methods, which is very hard for people to object to, or through salami slicing. You know this expression.
Yeah.
Invented by Matis Rakasi, the Hungarian tyrant. You slice away the liberties of people in such small quantities that by the time they realize what's happened, it's too late, but the whole sausage is still gone.
But I'm detecting they're overplaying their hand. I'm detecting people are actually starting to take more notice, at least here, and we're the most socialist progressive state in Australia. I'm in Victoria. We're the bellwether state for the rest of the nation, whether it comes to euthanasia laws or abortion till birth or gay rights, whatever. They're overplaying their hand, and people are starting to say, hang on, why are you persecuting a particular belief structure? Not necessarily Christianity, but the worldview, the tradition, the way we've carried on our lives in Australia. And people are starting to become less indifferent. So my question really is about Christianity across thousands of years. 2000, it doesn't seem to be able to be killed. It seems to go underground for a moment, come back up. So surely, Peter Hitchens, I can get a glimmer of hope from you for the future. If Christianity created such a beautiful empire before, surely we will see a resurgence again sometime in the future.
Well, no, you're mistaking two different things. And Christianity as a belief among people is, as you say, almost certainly impossible to destroy. But what happened with Christianity when it became the state religion of the Roman Empire and then and then the Roman Catholic Church became the dominating intellectual force of the whole of Europe, was that Christianity was there was actually a thing called Christendom. There were societies which were ordered basically upon a belief in Christianity, and whose rulers and leaders and intellectuals had to answer to people if they diverged away from that. People would say, look, well, you cannot do that under the rules which you yourself preach. The concept of hypocrisy became real, and that there were whole states, countries, and cultures in which that was the case. That's come to an end. These are two different things. A Christian hegemony over a whole civilization is one thing. The existence of some many millions of Christians, and there are many millions of Christians, for instance, in China, who are currently undergoing a great deal of persecution, which I'm sure that the Chinese Communist Party is going to find will not work. That's another thing. I don't particularly want to be a persecuted Christian myself anywhere, but it may be a measure of hope of some kind, but not of the hope of the restoration of the amazing thing, which was Christian civilization in a large part of the world. That seems to me to have gone, and Christians are going to have to cope with that.
So where's this glimmer of hope you were just speaking when I was saying, give me a glimmer of hope? You were starting to say, do you have a glimmer of hope?
It was you who'd been mentioning glimmers. I have no temporal hope whatsoever. I have hope in eternity. That's the only place you can repose it.
All right. Okay. Just last question. People take what you just said and they say, detractors from Christianity, that you're just using it as a crutch in the sense that you're just pushing all that matters onto eternity, and you're of no earth, so heavenly focused that you're no earthly good.
That's absolutely right.
Okay.
I accept that criticism completely.
Okay, so you're sounding quite defeatist.
I am no earthly good.
You know what I mean by no earthly good? I don't mean total depravity. I don't mean that.
No, I know exactly what you mean, and I agree.
Okay.
That's it. I have absolutely nothing to offer. I don't even have blood, toil, tears, and sweat. I have nothing to offer at all.
Peter, it feels like you're checking out.
Which I'm a bit closer to eternity than you, so I think about it more than you do.
Do you realize how much hope you've been giving to people just by speaking out, writing your columns? It feels like you're checked out and you're done. But you're not.
I have not tried to give anybody any hope at all.
I know you're not trying, but you are, my friend.
I would confess that when I wrote my first book, The Abolition of Britain, back in 1998, 99, I did think that by writing it, I might begin a process of counter-revolution. And the second book that I wrote, The Abolition of Liberty, a few years afterwards, I still had that illusion. Now I look back on that and I think, well, how stupid I was to imagine that this could be so. That I even said, look, my main purpose is to influence the intelligent thinkers and commentators of the left, because they dominate society so much that without their support, nothing can be done. But the response that I got from them, even ones whom I personally regarded as admirable and intelligent, was dismissive and often hostile. And I realized that they were not going to be influenced. And then my supposed own side couldn't see its own interests and has, in all cases, continued to support political parties, whether it be the Republicans in the United States, the Conservatives in Britain, or the Liberals in your own country, that are fake Conservative parties are not interested in serving anything at all. And in the case of the British Conservative Party, would guillotine the Queen in Trafalgar Square if it thought it would keep them in office. And I can't get people to even to consider obvious political tactics such as mass abstention from voting, which would be enormously effective. Because that would mean there'd be a Labour government or some such. I said, well, you've got a Labour government already.
Yeah, you do.
All the characteristics of the government you have are exactly the same as the Labour government. What I'm saying is you could actually overthrow. You can't sack. You can't sack the government because you'll get the same government whatever way you vote, but you can sack the opposition. But I couldn't get that simple concept across. And once at that point, I realized that the best thing to do was not to make myself unhappy by trying to do it.
Okay, so with the life you have left in what you know now...
supreme selfishness. I said, stop making yourself unhappy, trying to imagine you can do any political good. If anybody has taken political hope from everything I said, I don't think they've been listening.
That's a fair point. You did warn us in the Unlocked interview that when
I mean, let's look over what I've said to you. It's nothing new about any of it. I've not offered anybody any temporal hope. Look, the one thing I can say is this is the paradox of what I say. What if I'm wrong? Well, if I'm wrong, then what I say will perhaps infuriate the people who will decide that they will prove me wrong. Okay, good. I see no sign of it at the moment, but perhaps it will. I am infuriated, you know that, but so that may be my legacy, to infuriate enough people by saying there's no hope, that there actually finally are enough people to create hope, but there aren't at the moment.
You may have already answered a question I just had was, with the rest of your life, what is your greatest hope? What would you like to see before you die?
All my hopes are private, they're not public.
Okay, fair enough. Peter Hitchens, thank you so much for joining us here in Talking Into Australia. I should ask you a question I've asked every guest. It's very revealing. If I gave you a magic wand, Mr. Hitchens, how would you fix the entire world?
There is no such thing as a magic wand. I'm sorry, I can't help you there.
Love it. I love it. Thank you very much, sir. If people want to follow you or support you, buy your book, your book's a bit old now, the one you put out a couple of years ago. Are you still selling that? What's that one called?
Oh, all my books are still
all for sale. Starting
with The Abolition of Britain and right up to Unconventional Wisdom are all readily available, either, and most of them as audiobooks and ebooks as well. And they're all still, as far as I'm concerned, completely current. And I'm now currently working on a book about education, which I hope to deliver to the publishers sometime in the next 18 months.
The best way to buy your books and to follow you, where do you hang out the most?
Oh, well, I can be followed on Twitter through the absurd handle of Clark Micah. Don't ask me to explain. There is, I do have a blog posting called Peter Hitchens FAQs, where the explanation is available if you want to know what it is. I have a blog, the Peter Hitchens blog, which is archived and indexed and easily searchable, which covers most subjects apart from football that could be of interest to anybody. And I write a weekly column in the Mail on Sunday in London. So all my books are available, most of them as ebooks or as audiobooks read by me.
Oh, read by you. That's an important thing. People are not doing that anymore. Okay, great. Links in the description below, everyone, if you want to check out those things. Peter Hitchens, thank you for joining me, and congratulations for your complete release from incarceration in 6 days' time.
You think.